Thank you. Good morning. I'm massively jet-lagged. I came in last night from California. So as your host today, it was going to be a super fun experience, particularly for me. It's also a homecoming for me. I lived in Berlin for about 10 years ago, and I just realized this morning that I haven't been back to Berlin for the last 10 years. So this is literally the first time back for me in this wonderful city after I packed my stuff and moved to Silicon Valley. What I want to do today, outside of moderating a truly outstanding program for you with incredible speakers, is I want to spend about 30 minutes grounding you a little bit in what we call this exponential thinking. And to get us started, I want to do a little bit of a trip back in memory lane, and go back pretty much exactly 10 years ago. So January 9th in 2007, something really interesting happened at Moscone Center in San Francisco, which was this.
Today, Apple is going to reinvent the phone.
So that was about 10 years ago. 232 short days later, after Steve Jobs jumps on stage and presents the iPhone to the world, this made the rounds.
Nokia devices will allow you to touch the screen to navigate. Browsing your content couldn't be easier. Nokia allows you to share all of your content in many different ways. Uploading your photos to Flickr, for example, couldn't be simpler. All these experiences, so elegantly simple. It's what Nokia always has and always will deliver.
Interesting, right? Interesting, especially the last sentence. What Nokia always has and always will deliver. So who's using a Nokia phone today here? So really fascinating. So something really interesting happened. And Stephen Elop, the gentleman who ran Nokia at the time, said, we didn't do anything wrong, but somehow we lost. And it's actually, as comically as this sounds, it's actually true. So what happened to them is a lot of the disruption we will talk about over the next 2 days with you. And we will give you frameworks and ideas on how do you become the disruptor instead of becoming disrupted. But let's talk first about this idea of exponential thinking. And this is really what Singularity University is about. If you go back to your math class, Math 101, and you think about an exponential trend, your classic exponential trend looks a little bit like this. It's a doubling every time period. It goes from 1, 2, 4, 8, 16, etc. If you are an entrepreneur and you're pitching your company, your startup, to a Silicon Valley VC, this is your revenue slide. The most important and probably best known exponential trend is, of course, Moore's law. Gordon Moore, co-founder of Intel, formulated an observation he made about 50 years ago. And let's hear from Gordon himself.
So I took this doubling every year and extrapolated it 10 years, from 1965 to 1975, from 60 components to 60,000 components on a chip. A pretty wild extrapolation. And it turned out to be ridiculously accurate. One of my colleagues called this Moore's Law. Rather than just being something that chronicles the progress of the industry, it kind of became something that drove the progress of the industry.
So Moore's law at its core formulates that computers effectively get twice as fast every 2 years. That's the reason why the computer in your pocket today is so incredibly powerful. To make this a little bit more tangible, a little bit more easy to understand, let me show you a couple of examples. So this is a computer called ASCII Red. Was released in 1997, cost $55 million US, was commissioned by Sandia National Lab in the US, and was used mostly for two things. The one is weather predictions, calculating of weather patterns. The other one was to run simulations on the nuclear fallout of a potential Third World War. This computer was the size roughly of this room, a little bit smaller than this room, cost $55 million, was the very first computer in history which broke through the teraflop barrier. A teraflop is 1 trillion floating point operations per second. So imagine you would do 2 + 2 in your head 1 trillion times in 1 second. So an incredibly powerful computer. This is 1997. 9 years later, you walk into Best Buy, or here in Germany into Saturn, You buy a Sony PlayStation 3, costs you $499, gets you 2.1 teraflops. Within 9 years, you go from something a nation state uses to simulate World War III to something your kids play World War III on a big screen television. Right? Here's the second thing which happens in computing. I actually fundamentally believe computing is at a really interesting intersection where we bifurcate computing. Computing gets super powerful and it gets super small. Here's an example. This is a computer called Pi Zero. In real world, this is about the size of a pack of gum. Costs you $5. You can put a monitor, a keyboard, a mouse, and some memory in it, and you can technically run Windows on this machine. Has 191 megaflops. So for $5, for the price of a venti Starbucks latte, at least in Silicon Valley, you now get 2.5 times the compute power of a Cray 1 supercomputer. The Cray 1 was released in the mid-70s and really defined the era of supercomputing. Each of those Cray 1s had more compute power than all of NASA had together to put the man on the moon. Now you get for $5, literally a cup of coffee, you get 2.5 times the compute power NASA had to put the man on the moon. That is, if you believe we put a man on the moon. It's a different story. I won't go there. And it goes super small. What you're seeing here is a golf ball and a dimple in a golf ball, and you see a little processor in that dimple. That processor is 2 millimeters by 1.6 millimeters, has the raw compute power of an early-stage Pentium processor, costs you 75 cents. This is the core and the heart of what is called Internet of Things, or IoT. There's many, many more like this these days. This processor and all its little brothers and sisters is the sole reason why everything which has an electric cord will become smart. There's absolutely no question about it. And the reason for that is you get it for free. Why wouldn't you? Like, I get asked this question all the time, like, why would I want to have a smart toaster? And I don't know, I don't want to have a smart toaster, but you get it for free. Every light bulb in your house will become smart. This is the reason why Cisco tells you that there will be 20 billion connected devices in less than 3 years. Again, because you get it for free. Our co-founder Ray Kurzweil once formulated this in something he calls the law of accelerating returns. It's a fairly dense paper, but in the short version of it, it gives you 2 interesting indications. The first is this: the total rate of change is accelerating itself. So we're seeing more and more change in the world happening, and because it moves on an exponential curve, the total amount of change is accelerating, which is the reason why, realistically, when you pop up your head today and you look around, you feel left out. You feel like the world is moving at a pace you can't even keep up with. That happens to me, and I happen to live, at the epicenter of a lot of that change. The second interesting thing Ray did is he looked at Moore's law, or the underpinnings of Moore's law, and determined, by looking at actual data points, that this trend, this exponential trend of computing, is actually much older than what Moore's law suggests. It's about 110 years old since we effectively started doing these kind of things. And here's an interesting thing you can do with this graph. If you stipulate that Moore's law will be true in the future, and there's no reason to not believe this at the moment, both historically, because we have 110 years of actual data points, as well as when you speak to all the experts, they will all tell you that the ideas of Moore's law seem to continue into the future. You can determine the point in time when you have a computer which has the raw compute power of a human brain, which happens in less than 20 years. So in less than 20 years, you will have a computer which has the raw compute power of a human brain. And then we know that Moore's law stipulates that 2 years later, we've got 2 human brains in a computer, 4, 8, 16, and so on. Until the year 2050 to 2060, when you have got 7.4 billion brains in one machine, every single human brain, raw compute power, in a single machine. That is to say that the world you're living in will look dramatically different tomorrow than it looks today. That is also to say that the computer in your pocket will soon be much smarter than you are. My wife keeps reminding me, because I'm using my phone a lot, that this is already true. But it will be true in the future in many, many more ways. Now, here's the interesting thing. You know all this, because computing is such a clear paradigm. It's so around us. Now, the interesting thing is that these exponential trends happen in many other industries as well, mostly driven by the rise of information technology being at the underpinnings of many other industries. I want to give you 2 examples where this happens in really interesting ways and will fundamentally change the way we live our worlds. And you will have amazing speakers who will go very deep into those topics. The first is this. DNA, specifically DNA sequencing. So the first time we sequenced a human genome was part of what is called the Human Genome Project. It was completed in 1999, cost us $2.7 billion US dollars, took us 7 years. One genome, 7 years of effort. This was a massive, massive breakthrough for mankind. In 2007, the price dropped to $350,000. The company came out and basically did this as a commercial service. In 2014, a company called Illumina out of San Diego, California, sequences a genome for $1,000 using a machine which looks like a big photocopier. This is the steepest drop in price performance we've ever seen in any industry, bar none. You go from something nation states can do it, and they can do it once, within 15 years, to something your doctor can prescribe. Now, the interesting question you should ask yourself, and this is what I ask entrepreneurs I work with all the time, is when you look at a price performance graph like this, you want to ask two questions. The one is, where does this go? And you talk to experts, and they will tell you this price will drop to pennies, very close to free in the next 10 years. And then you want to ask yourself, what do you do with it? I can give you two examples. The first one is this. This comes out of Singularity University as one of our companies. They're called Miraculous. They're taking a simple blood test and can reliably detect more than 10 different types of cancer pre-stage 1 in your blood, because those types of cancers shed RNA, which is a subset of DNA, into your bloodstream. And they have a biochemical test to find these. The test costs less than $200 to administer. They're currently in preclinical trials. If they can do what they say they do, and it looks good, we will think about cancer detection in very, very different ways. Here's the other way, and we will explore this a little bit more today already. Technology always has an interesting dark side. So technology in itself is agnostic. It's always the use case which comes out of this. But I want to show you an interesting example. This is a friend of mine. She's an artist based out of New York, Heather Dewey Hogboard. And Heather has a really interesting art project thinking and working with DNA.
We don't know yet how our DNA might be used against us in the future.
New York artist Heather Dewey Hogboard.
One artist in New York is making 3D models of people's faces, people that she's never met.
She calls the project Stranger Visions. The strangers are people whose genetic material she finds on the sidewalks and subways of New York City.
How much can I actually find out about you from something that you accidentally leave behind?
Fascinating, huh? Let's talk about privacy. So just to uncover what she's doing, she's literally picking up cigarette butts she finds in the streets of New York City. She takes the saliva, which is on the cigarette butt, extracts the DNA out of this, which is something that the FBI is doing for the last, 20 years. If you're watching CSI on the television, you know all about this. And then she's sequencing the DNA using one of these machines, which sequences the DNA for $1,000 and then reconstructs your facial features out of that DNA and creates these 3D masks. Every single one of you is currently shedding DNA. You're losing hair cells, skin cells, follicle. You use a glass of water, you leave saliva on this glass of water. Your genetic information is everywhere. So we're moving rapidly into a world, again, just to remind you, we're moving rapidly into a world which will look very, very different tomorrow than it looks today. And the next 2 days will all be about this. Here's another example, energy. So today, energy is mostly fossil fuel-based, coal, natural gas, oil, with all the challenges that brings. An alternative to this is very obviously solar, which has been pioneered here in Germany. Solar is a really interesting technology out of two reasons. First one is this. When you look at the cost ratio, the price-performance ratio, it has dropped from about $80 a kilowatt hour to, in 2015 in California, 30 cents a kilowatt hour, which is parity, which is the same price we're paying California without subsidies for coal-based power. And 1 year later, Dubai announced that they're currently building an 800 megawatt solar-powered facility where the internal price is less than 3 cents. What this points to is an interesting point, and we come back to this later. We're perceiving the world as a world of scarcity. And this makes sense because, you know, when I grew up, like in the 80s, we talked about peak oil, and then the 90s was peak oil, and then 2000s was peak oil, but eventually we will get to peak oil. In reality, when we use technology, we can make the world an abundant resource. This is work from a German PhD, actually, and what you're seeing there, the square on your left, where it says Welt or world, if we were to build a solar panel the size of that square, that is enough to power the world's energy consumption as it stands today. We are surrounded by an abundance of energy. We just need to harvest it in the right ways. Now think about what the problems, which problems we can solve in the world which are energy dependent. Something like clean drinking water, desalination is a massive energy problem. I can solve it if I just have access to clean and abundant energy. We'll get back to this topic in a minute. Here's the challenge. So now you understand that the world is moving on these exponential curves, or at least you get a taster for it. Here's the challenge. Albert Allen Bartlett, who taught at UC Boulder, once said the greatest shortcoming of the human race is our inability to understand the exponential function. Let me explain this to you with a very simple example. Since we crawled out of our caves, like 350,000-ish years ago, the world around us, the observable universe is linear. The days come and go. It's a very linear progression. It's a 24-hour cycle. The seasons come and go. And linear projections helps us to not get eaten by the saber-toothed tiger. We are drilled. We are conditioned to understand linear trends. Here's a very simple example. Imagine you take 30 linear steps. Imagine you take one step after the other. How far do you get? You get 30 meters. You get a really good sense how far this is. If you were to ask me now, how far is 30 meters? I would basically say roughly towards the end of this hall. And then if you ask me how far is half of it, I would also give you a very good example. Now let me put you to the test. How far would 30 exponential steps be? If every step is twice as far as your last one. So you go from 1, 2, 4, 8, 16, 32. You do this 30 times, how far do you get? I will not put you on the test, you're too many. But let me tell you what typically happens. Someone somewhere in the back yells, it's a mile or kilometer. For some reason, the human brain seems to go to 1,000. I have no idea why. And then you've got the people in the first row, and the people in the first row, they're nodding and they're listening, and they know that exponential trends needs to be bigger. And the number one answer I get is, and please check in with yourself, to the moon, which is great. Because then I always ask people, that's fantastic, how far is it to the moon in miles or kilometers? And nobody knows. So let me uncover this. 30 exponential steps, for those of you who are trained mathematicians, 2 to the power of 29 is 1 billion meters, 25 times around planet Earth, or to the moon, back from the moon, and halfway to the moon again. This demonstrates two things. The first is, you're really ill-equipped to intuitively understand exponential trends. You have to do the math on a piece of paper. The second is, if you have something which was analog, something which moves linear, in 30 time periods, it only moves to 30. If it moves on an exponential curve, it goes to 1 billion. Here's the challenge with this. We now understand that technology moves on an exponential curve. Our thinking is linear. In this diagram are 3 interesting parts. Part number 1, what we call disappointment. This is where you are when you look at exponentially accelerating technologies, because they inch forward at the beginning. It's really hard for you to understand them. You get disappointed. If anyone here has ever played with Google Glass, it's a classic example. I was at Google when we released Google Glass. I was wearing it for about 3 months on my head, and I can tell you it's too expensive, the battery life is terrible, the features are pretty mediocre, and you look like an idiot. So what happens is, you're disappointed, rightfully so. The problem is, if you're disappointed, you're dismissing. But then you get to this, what we call the iPhone moment. This is the moment when Steve Jobs gets on stage and shows you the iPhone. I was in Berlin watching a live keynote, like a live stream of this event, and next to me was a gentleman in a probably $3,000 beautiful suit, and he pulls out, and this is a true story, he pulls out his $800 recently purchased Nokia phone, and looks at the phone, and pardon my language, looks at the phone and says, shit. Because he intuitively understood that phones don't have buttons anymore, phones have glass. Phones are not phones anymore, phones are little computers. His $800 phone is worthless. And then you get to chaos and amazement. This is the world where you can't even keep up with the change you're seeing in the world anymore. The challenge is if you stay on this line, this is your path to doom. This is where Nokia stayed. Unfortunately, Nokia's last quarter loss was $714 million. Nokia was the iPhone. Nokia had the highest profit margins in the industry. They've got the best brand in the industry. If you wanted to buy a premium phone, you would buy Nokia. This is your first insight. It's incredibly trivial and incredibly powerful. Once a technology becomes digitized, it moves on an exponential curve. If you find a technology which is not yet digitized and you move it into a digital world, it moves on an exponential curve. The biggest business opportunities are those. That's the reason why in Silicon Valley we go crazy about two particular industries. The one is healthcare, because healthcare is mostly analog and a $1 trillion business. And the other one is agricultural technology, farming. Because again, it's a mostly analog technology. Let me give you a few frameworks on how to make sense of the change you're seeing in the world. You now understand that they're moving on an exponential curve. Let's talk about frameworks. The first one is this. This is a descriptive framework. This is Peter Diamandis, our co-founder, and he developed this thing called the 6 Ds of disruption. And it works like this. This is the digital camera, the very first digital camera, invented by a gentleman called Steven Sasson, who worked for a company called Kodak. Ironically, the same company which got displaced by digital cameras. But this camera had 0.01 megapixels, took pictures in black and white, recorded them on a cassette tape. It took about 23 seconds for you to sit still for the camera to record it, and then the way you wanted to look at this is you plugged it into a television set to look at the picture. Of course it was terrible. So here's how this works. In the beginning, you take something which is analog and you digitize it. You take something which is film, which is a chemical process mostly, and you turn it into a digital good. We already talked about this, that in the beginning, these trends are deceptive. 0.01 megapixels is horrible, it's terrible, it's really, really bad. Now, digital cameras move on a perfect exponential trend. When Steven had his second camera ready, it had 0.02 megapixels. The camera after that had 0.04. The camera after that had 0.08. And every single time he showed this to Kodak, the Kodak top brass looked at this and said, it's not good enough, it will not be good. Eventually, it becomes disruptive. 2 megapixels. 2 megapixels was when I bought a Canon Digital Xs here in Europe, Canon Digital ELPH in the US. 2 megapixel camera, $499. I never bought film again. And then this happens. So technology becomes dematerialized. As you can see right now, nobody's holding up a camera, you're all holding up a phone. The technology in your camera is like about $2 worth of hardware, and the rest is software. It becomes dematerialized. It becomes demonetized. You're not buying a camera, you're not buying film anymore, you don't need to develop the film anymore, and you're probably not even buying a camera anymore, unless you're like a professional photographer. And then lastly, you're democratizing access. There's now 3 billion pictures being uploaded to the internet every single day. It's an interesting framework to think about where an industry is going and what the steps are to get there. Here's the second concept. We talked about this a little earlier. It's called abundance. So we talked about this in the sense of energy. We're seeing the world of energy as a world which is scarce. It's a scarce resource. Where in reality, if we're leveraging technology in the right ways, we can actually create abundance. Here's an interesting example. Take books. Books are a terribly scarce resource because you ultimately have to grow trees and have to turn those trees into paper and print on them, and then you need to store it. It's really, really complicated. The moment you turn this into a digital good, all this goes away. Digital goods have really interesting properties. Amongst them, storage is close to zero, cost-wise. Cost of distribution is close to zero, and cost of making a perfect copy is close to zero, which means that all the business models change around this. Here's an example. You take music. We got Sean Fanning bringing out Napster. Music was an oil-based industry. You bought records and CDs which are made out of plastic, which in return is made out of oil. Sean Fanning comes along, gets us Napster. Napster turns music into MP3s, they become digital. Now I pay $9.99 and I have 140 million songs in my pocket through Spotify. Or you take knowledge. Jimmy Wales comes along, brings out Wikipedia, unleashes Wikipedia on the world. Now the world's information is at my fingertips. Encyclopedia Britannica, or when I grew up in Germany, Bertelsmann's lexicon, gone. We don't need them anymore. Here's the important insight. I think what a lot of people get wrong is they think that when something becomes digital, it becomes free. Chris Anderson, actually, the guy who published Wired magazine, wrote a book about this called Free. I fundamentally believe that not to be true. I actually believe that just because the properties change, cost of distribution goes to zero, cost of replication goes to zero, the business models will change. I recently spoke to a German large pharma company and asked them, let's talk about prescription drugs. What are prescription drugs at their core? Well, they're molecules, right? They're a combination of a particular set of molecules, and you produce them and you put them into blister packs and you sell them. Well, in the future, we can already, by the way, we can already print on a molecular basis. It's super, super expensive, but it's going to be available to us in the near to midterm future. So in the future, and we talked about this with these pharma people, I'm probably not buying the actual physical good anymore. What I'm going to buy is I'm buying the formulation, the digital good, and then I'm going to print it at home or at a pharmacy. This pharma company came to me and said, like, you know what? We should think about a subscription model. So instead of selling you drugs through a pharmacy, I'm just giving you a Spotify pass to your prescription medicine. Think about what this means for piracy. Today in the US, if I want to buy pirated medication, I buy them off a pharmacy in Mexico or Canada and have them shipped. In the future, I can just torrent them. So the world will look very, very dramatically different than the world we're living in today. Geoffrey Moore wrote 25 years ago a book called Crossing the Chasm. When I read this book first, like 25 years ago, it became the Bible for us. I fundamentally believe, this is probably one of the most important books you can read today because it's so incredibly relevant in this new exponential world. Here's how this works. This is the short version of it. As a product matures, it is being sold to different types of customers, and it has different quantities of being sold. It starts out with the innovator, the people who create the product. Of course, there's very few of them. Then it gets to what is called the early adopters. Early adopters are crazy people like myself. I'm buying this Pebble watch on Kickstarter, and the reason for me to buy this watch is because I want to be hip and cool, and I want to have the latest gadget, and for me it's okay if this watch doesn't work properly. It's okay for me to update the firmware and work out the kinks. Then eventually get to early majority. Early majority are the people who buy the watch and they buy it off Amazon, for example. If you're wearing an Apple Watch today, you're in the class of early majority. You still want to be hip and cool, but it needs to work. And then eventually get to late majority. Late majority is my mom. My mom sees the watch and it's like, oh, this is great, I want one. For her, the damn thing better works. And then eventually you get to what is called the laggards. This is my grandma. My grandma wants to buy a new watch. There's nothing else but smartwatches, so she has to buy a smartwatch. So different groups. Here's the big insight. There's a massive gap, a massive chasm in technology between what is called the early adopters and the early majority. This is where 99% of Silicon Valley companies go and die, because they're selling to Silicon Valley type of people, but they never leap out of this. Let me show you an example. What you're going to see is a video of a woman, an older woman, sitting in a Tesla. The Tesla has autopilot activated, which is their self-driving car feature. Next to her is her grandson or her son recording her experience with this car.
I'm scared. Oh, there's cars coming. Oh, there's cars. Ah! Bill, just put me back for me control it. Oh, dear Jesus. I could never. Oh, where's it going? God damn, Bill. Oh, my God. Oh, this is so scary. Oh, Jesus, this is my first day out, and I'm about to die.
Oh, come on, relax.
So don't clap. Let me be super, super clear here. Putting your mom into a situation where your mom says, I'm about to die is not cool. You sitting next to it, filming it so that I can see it on the internet, absolutely not cool. But the reason why I'm showing you this is, by the way, I fundamentally believe first of all, the chasm is staring in your face right here. Right here is the chasm. And this is, by the way, also the reason why I think that the current generation of self-driving cars is fundamentally flawed and will not be successful. Because the chasm is so big. And you know what the chasm is? This. The steering wheel moves. I was at Google when we released Chauffeur, the self-driving car project. I'm an early adopter. I'm pretty crazy. I'm sitting in Chauffeur. I'm freaking out. Because you feel absolutely out of control when you see the steering wheel move by itself. So how do you overcome the chasm? Many different ways. One way could be you can educate the public. You can say, no, it's okay, you're safe, and the steering wheel moves, that's okay. It's really hard, it's expensive, and it takes time. Here's another way. You do this. This is Google's, or now Waymo's, new car. They removed the steering wheel. That thing doesn't have a steering wheel anymore. It's a little pod. You punch in the address where you want to go, it drives. You put people in it, it looks like this.
Hey, hooray! We're like queens. Yeah.
You said relax. You don't need to do nothing. It knows when it needs to stop. It knows when it needs to go.
What she really liked was that it slowed down before it went around a curve and then accelerated in the curve. She's always trying to get me to do it that way.
That's the way I learned in high school driver's ed.
So as you're bringing new technologies to the world, and as you're seeing for the next 2 days, these crazy, crazy technologies, you're going through this and in your heads, think about the chasm. The question I love to ask people is like, what does 10x look like? This is moonshot thinking. Like, how do you make what you're doing 10 times as good, 10 times as performant, 10 times as cheap? Ask yourself this question because it forces you out of your box. It forces you to completely revisit the way you see the world. We will force you to see 10x over the next 48 hours. I can guarantee you that. So here's the bigger thing. The bigger thing is technology for the sake of technology is interesting, and we all can geek out on this like all day long, but it's actually absolutely, utterly meaningless. What really matters is the big picture. About 20-ish years ago, I read this quote while being at university. Albert Einstein said, "We shall require a substantially new manner of thinking if mankind is to survive." It freaked me out. I couldn't sleep for a week. Now, don't get me wrong, all the indicators point in the right direction. There's less people dying of wars and famines, and we're on average getting better incomes, etc. That's all great. And I personally, fundamentally believe that we have our work cut out for us. The problems are so big that we better get working. Here's an example. So you take global warming, sea levels will rise by 2 meters. A lot of people don't get this, but when sea levels rise by 2 meters by the end of this century, Manhattan Island, just as one example, will be flooded. It's gone. Manhattan Island is currently 8 million people. It's an inhabited place for 8 million people. These 8 million people will be displaced. The Syrian refugee crisis, which you have front row seats to, is just 1.5 million people. There will be tens, if not hundreds of millions of people who need to move. This will be the biggest threat to mankind. I personally think it's the biggest threat to mankind. Here's another example, population. There will be 9 billion people on this planet by 2050, according to the United Nations. To feed these people, we currently have enough food to feed 2 billion people. It's just in the wrong places, and that's a hard problem to solve already. If we want to feed 9 billion people, we need to grow our agricultural output by 2% annually. We're currently growing by 1%. We will not have enough food to feed these people. You take something like poverty. There's 3 billion people who live on less than $2.50 a day. I personally cannot even buy a cup of coffee in Silicon Valley on less than $2.50. You go to an area like sanitation. There's 2.5 billion people who don't have access to proper sanitation, making diarrhea the #1 killer in the world. You take something like water. 800 million people don't have access to clean drinking water. Literacy, 757 people can't read or write. You got malnutrition, where a child dies every 8 seconds of malnutrition in a world where in the first world, obesity is our #1 health problem. Here's the thing. I don't want to leave you on a downer. I'm probably the most optimistic person you can meet. There might be a reason why I got kicked out of this wonderful country that shipped me off to Silicon Valley. But I want to give you a short clip. So first of all, I have the privilege of seeing people and working with people who are solving for these problems. And I want to give you a short clip of the young Steve Jobs who, and you can disagree with Steve Jobs as much as you want, but he says something very, very important and very interesting, which I want to play for you.
When you grow up, you tend to get told that the world is the way it is, and your life is just to live your life inside the world, try not to bash into the walls too much, try to have a nice family life, have fun, save a little money. But life, that's a very limited life. Life can be much broader once you discover one simple fact, and that is everything around you that you call life was made up by people that were no smarter than you. And you can change it. You can influence it. You can build your own things that other people can use. And the minute that you understand that you can poke life and actually something will, if you push in, something will pop out the other side, that you can change it, you can mold it. That's maybe the most important thing, is to shake off this erroneous notion that life is there and you're just going to live in it, versus embrace it, change it, improve it, make your mark upon it. I think that's very important. And however you learn that, once you learn it, you'll want to change life and make it better, because it's kind of messed up in a lot of ways. Once you learn that, you'll never be the same again.
I have the interesting privilege of working with the US Navy SEALs, which is really interesting given that I'm a pacifist. Makes for very interesting conversation. But the Navy SEALs have a handbook which they give to young Navy SEALs, and in this handbook, on one of the first pages, you'll find a formula, and that formula is your rate of growth. And what they mean is your personal growth, you as a person. And truth be told, what do you care more about than growing? The reason why you spend 2 days here in this room instead of being outside and doing something else is because you want to grow. Your rate of growth equals the magnitude of the challenge multiplied by the intensity of the attack. If you believe this formula to be true, and I fundamentally believe this to be true, why wouldn't you pick the hardest problem you can find and attack it as hard as you possibly can? Because that's the way you grow. I want to leave you with a last quote. This is George Bernard Shaw, who said, "The reasonable man adapts himself to the world. The unreasonable one persists in trying to adapt the world to himself. Therefore, all progress depends on the unreasonable man and woman." If I have a wish for you personally, it is that you all have to be unreasonable. We all have to be unreasonable to change this world for the better. Don't forget, we're at this really interesting intersection point. These are truly the most exciting and arguably the most scariest times of this world, but we have a choice. We have a choice to make how the world will look like. And the one thing I can guarantee, regardless which choice you're making, as long as you're making a choice, you're good. Because if you're not making a choice, if you're not moving on this curve, the world will happen to you and you become a passive player in a world which you don't control. With that being said, let's kick off the day. You want to see more stuff? Good. As you're going through the next 48 hours, you will hear and see pretty crazy stuff. And I can guarantee a lot of that stuff might be kind of on the edge of what you're actually interested in. Like if you are like a car executive, you might be very interested in autonomous vehicles. You might less be interested in synthetic biology. The great Guy Kawasaki, one of the early employees over at Apple, once taught me an interesting question. And that question is, isn't that interesting? So I encourage you, as you're going through the day and you hear stuff people tell you and you've got conversations with other people in the breaks, ask yourself that question. Because one thing you will learn over the next 2 days is not just where technology is going, where individual technologies are going, but you also will learn that most technologies are starting to converge. And they're becoming really interesting and intermingled. With that being said, I think we've got a little bit of time for questions. If you have anything burning, throw it at me. Otherwise, I would get us kick-started into the day. Pretty flashed? Pretty like, whoa, head spinning? Yeah. Trust me, by the end of the 48 hours, your head will be mush. We've got a question up here. Let's briefly wait for the mic runner so we can all hear you.
I'm Jochen Wermuth, very happy about this enthusiastic presentation, thank you. I care a lot about climate change, and I believe we're very much on this point where we broke through grid parity, where electric cars are now competitive. I believe we're almost there.
Yep.
But we're also just 4 years left, if we continue to do what we're doing, to kill ourselves because we go over the tipping points. We will emit so much CO2 if we put in place more coal power plants now that we will go over the tipping point. So can you give me some more optimism why we'll make it the next 4 years, not just, but let's make it. Thank you.
Yes. So first of all, I highly encourage you to see my dear colleague Ramiz Naam tomorrow, who's talking about energy, and he will do a deep dive into these topics of energy. Again, I fundamentally believe, despite my own government, which I didn't elect, being probably skeptical about the effects of climate change, I actually believe that, first of all, the international community currently rallying together in very interesting and unprecedented ways. Secondly, we see technologies which actually start reversing some of the changes of climate change, so sequestering of CO2, for example. I give you just one tiny example which gives you incredibly interesting hope. I met an entrepreneur. She's about that tall, it's like 55 years old, a greyhound breeder, so totally weird, wacky person, comes to me and tells me that she built this CO2 sequestering system, which takes effectively CO2 coming out of steel mills and sequesters it using bacteria into fuel, into biofuels. And I was like, oh, that's interesting, like you do this in a lab, right? She's like, no, I actually built a facility in China. And this year is the first time where we will deliver jet fuel to Virgin America, and they will fly on jet fuel, which is carbon negative. So seeing 55-year-old little ladies who are growing greyhounds, sequestering CO2 out of the atmosphere and creating negative carbon emissions on a plane, I'm optimistic for this world. Probably anything else? We've got something, oh wow. That will be a challenge for our mic runner. Mic runner, challenge accepted. I know, right? It's very linear, yeah, absolutely.
Thank you for the talk, and actually my question is quite general. So I like the point about the linear function versus exponential function, that we cannot understand it at the moment. So do you think we should change something in our education system to make sure that the next generation will give us more of this little woman creating the power?
Yes, absolutely. Education needs to change in pretty dramatic ways. There's no question about it. I spend quite a bit of time talking to people who are in the education space. I'm not an expert, so I'm coming from like a very amateurish perspective, but I fundamentally believe we need to change the way we think about education and we execute education. Again, luckily, we see it in pockets happening. I give you one simple example. I do this with students all the time. It's like to illustrate the power of exponentials and how our thinking is really not up to snuff. Who here is using Siri or Google Now, Cortana? Okay, so most likely your experience with it is pretty mediocre, right? It's like, it's okay, it's interesting, but it doesn't really work. So here's the interesting point about Siri. Siri is about 7 years old. It's 2 years under SRI and then about 5 years under Apple now. Siri currently moves on an exponential curve. It literally doubles in capacity every year. How good is Siri in 7 years? Right? How good is it? Well, here's an example, right? Like a lot of people, when you ask them, and they will say, well, it's going to be better, sure, like 10 times as good, right? Well, it's going to be 128 times as good because we can do the math on it. Now, the interesting question becomes, what does that even mean, right? So then you break down Siri and you say, so Siri consists of 3 parts largely: voice recognition, reasoning to understand what you actually mean, and then a bunch of services it is connected to. When those get 128 times better, and you can do the math on it, Siri will be better than any human in understanding you. So in 5 years, you will be absolutely naturally conversing with your phone, your car, whatever, wherever you have a voice assistant built in, which is the reason why Amazon spends so much money on Alexa, because they want to dominate that space. So it's an interesting exercise, and again, to your point, like we need to teach kids that kind of thinking, right? This change in mindset. Let me tell you, your minds will be changed after these 48 hours. I'm pretty convinced.